I live in two worlds, really. The world of policy and the world of academia. I feel that the dominant tone so far this morning has been a practitioner, policy-oriented, strategic, professional perspective. I am going to step back from that role and reflect more about some of the research ideas and experiences that are floating around in the world of academia about issues of governance. And I've chosen a title of Emerging Policy Systems because I think we are at a particular moment when policy systems are changing, when there are new possibilities now being talked about, and where the PlanApp decree, having read it, speaks very much to the contemporary debates about what governments can and should do, how policy should be made, capabilities of public administration, how to ensure efficiency and participation. All of these issues that are inside the PlanApp agenda are widely discussed internationally. And I'm interested in uncertainty and time because I think what the new systems are doing to some extent is changing our understanding of time and building on the uncertainty that we all know is central. So my argument this morning is to address these kind of questions and to consider public management from that perspective. One boundary that I am taking to draw for myself is the difference between government and governance. In academic speak, governance includes the wider society, non-governmental actors, citizens, civil society, as well as the official agents of government. And this is not in any way to diminish or to decenter the role of government, but rather to recognize that for governments it is a problem how to be organized in order to encourage wider participation and engagement in policy. And thinking about governance allows us to think about that question more carefully. I tend to come at things from two perspectives, from a social science perspective related to evaluation and related to organization theory, because I'm interested in effects, I'm interested in what we can learn, I'm interested in the long-term ways in which capacities accumulate over time. My general perspective is, if you want to understand how governments learn, it's through shocks, changes in circumstances, political crises, things that demand learning. So if you look to the extended growth period after the Second World War, when public services were expanding, when economies were reconstructing, when budgets were expanding, there wasn't an awful lot of public management. One of the reasons there didn't need to be much public management is one was delivering standard services in a standard way that didn't require a great deal of sophisticated management. The oil shock of the early 1970s created demands for efficiency, for better budgeting, for professionalized management across public sectors, across the Western world. And the outsourcing experiences of the 1980s related to ideas of the changing nature of the state shocked public services as well into doing more complicated things, but also into having to think about what management really meant. So these long-term historical trends, the dimension of time, relates to the notions of persistence and trajectories and duration. And persistence, what is carried over from past policies, as I've just been mentioning. Trajectories in terms of when do effects actually happen, from policy initiatives, and duration in terms of sustainability. So I've already said that different historical periods leave behind them different notions of what we can learn. And coping with crises and oil shocks and COVID-19, all of which create an impetus for policy changing, for setting up the kind of initiatives at the center of government that Elsa was referring to earlier. So I always think that learning by doing is a more credible means of governments learning than big reform processes. It always seems to me that it is by the experience of trying to respond to some difficult demands that people reorientate their thinking, that structures are rethought. And persistence, yes, includes habitual ideas, but trajectories is also important in terms of time. We used to think about evaluation, which is one practice that I involved myself in, as being something that happened at the end of a program. What we now know is that Michael Woolcock in the World Bank is a very influential person in this field, that trajectories can be of very different shapes. You can end a program and there's no evidence of anything happened, and then 5 years later you discover it was a success. You think something was a success as against the initial period, and it turns out to be a failure. So when we want to understand sustainability of change, we also need to understand trajectories. And policies have a long tail. They have the ability to change their purposes. So let me give an example of that. I did a retrospective review for the Swedish government on their international development policies over 20 years. And we looked back at all the documentation that had been produced 20 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 10 years ago, and we compared what those assessments of the success of policies told us and what we now knew and what was being judged. And the conclusion that was reached very quickly was that the context had changed to such a degree that the assumptions made about what constituted success 10 or 15 years ago had changed. And that policy that was judged to have had one quality began to take on different attributes as values changed, as attitudes towards human rights changed, as attitudes towards development changed. A similar thing was done by the European Union in relation to infrastructure investments. So they looked at all the judgments about the success of investments in the past over a 20-year period. And again, they found that if you were looking at them again today, you would reach a completely different conclusion from what you reached when they were originally initiated. The reason that this is important is that one of the effects of complexity and uncertainty is that judgments about what is good policy results are not fixed in time. They actually change as the initiatives take on different kinds of qualities. The basic perspective that a lot of policy analysts and political scientists are taking at this moment in time is, like Yves does, to regard the state as necessarily strategic and agile. Be aware of the long term, but be prepared to change things in the shorter term. And that is beginning to be adopted in quite a few policy circles I'm familiar with. So the European Commission used to be very rigid about, we had 7-year programs, and the programs had fixed goals, and we knew what the goals were at the beginning, and we weren't going to change those goals, and there was very great resistance to any attempts to reprogram, as it was called. Over the last 2 programming periods, we now have the emergence of reprogramming as being a positive action, which is encouraged in the recognition that the assumptions made when the programs began cannot necessarily be assumed to remain true for such an extended period. And I think that attempt to make policies flexible is extremely important in terms of living in an uncertain era where the assumptions we make at the beginning don't always stay true. So evaluation as a result, for example, moves upstream and downstream in interesting ways to respond to these kinds of uncertainties. It was interesting to hear Elsa talk about foresight, and I would regard within the broad family of evaluation all sorts of tools like regulatory impact assessment and foresight, as well as ex-ante evaluation. But the important thing is that looking backwards to origins and looking carefully forward from an early stage of policy formulation gives you a quite different perspective and ability to plan than if all you're doing is starting with the short-term intentions of the immediate political initiative. And downstream, we're also interested in what we learn from different kinds of policy initiatives, what we learn through knowledge management, new data analysis capabilities, and monitoring that extend beyond the end of a formal policy or program, that one is constantly monitoring these kinds of initiatives. Okay. There are various ways in which people have described uncertainty, and three popular phrases or popular ways of thinking about it, both in the research literature and in some areas of practice, is to talk about wicked problems, cultural change, and the challenge of the nexus. All of these things are slightly different, but they also slightly overlap, and it's worthwhile just reflecting on them for the purposes of today. Wicked problems are probably the best marketed of those concepts. I think with academic ideas, you always have to be, it's a bit like why certain artists from Delft in the Netherlands are very famous and others are not, even though they're equally good. I think they marketed themselves better. And I think the wicked problems people marketed themselves very well. It relies on a kind of a systems logic. Somebody called Russ Ackoff, who was a great leader of systems thinking in Pennsylvania, used to say you can't solve one problem without creating another problem. And that's a characteristic of wicked problems. There's difficulty of people agreeing about problems, let alone defining what the problem is, let alone agreeing about the solution. So evidence is contested. Elsa also referred to the trust in science, and I think it's not only trust in science, it's trust between citizens about whether their beliefs are reflected in the information that they are given. So wicked problems are characterized by situations where people say, don't tell me the evidence, I don't believe in it, or more to the point, a judgment about these kind of problems and policy responses is not whether it was successful or not, but whether the result was good or bad. So there's a value element to these kind of assumptions. And wicked problems are intractable. They go on for a long time. And they never seem to go away and they may not be solved. So that there's that kind of notion of problems that need to be managed rather than solved and thrown away. And you have examples are in aspects of environmental protection, immigration, citizenship, unemployment policies that don't fit into an administrative box. They're resistant to performance management and goal setting, and they pose very particular kinds of problems. There's also a related lens around cultural change. I mean, policies have become a lot more ambitious in our lifetime. There was a time when we knew what an employment policy was. We counted the meters of advanced factories that we built, and we counted the number of jobs created. Now policy is interested in developing an entrepreneurial culture. interested in developing knowledge-intensive value chains. These are much more complex and culturally differentiated notions. We used to judge exams in terms, well, education in terms of exam performance, and we still do. I'm not critical of exam performance as one measure, but policymakers are also concerned with lifelong learning. They're also concerned with the learning society. They're also concerned with creating workplaces where the renewal of competence and capability is all the time there. We used to judge healthcare in terms of inoculating babies and the number of hospital beds we had. And now we talk about lifestyle change and healthy diets and accident prevention. So a lot of the uncertainty in policy areas, to my mind, is not because policies become less capable or that the world has become more difficult. It's the ambition has become a lot more serious. And another related lens is that of the nexus. People have talked for a long time about the relationship between energy, water, and food. You need water for energy production, you need energy for food production, food production requires energy. Big debate about biofuels a couple of years ago, about if we put all the crops for the purposes of making an alternative to diesel, what effect does it have on the food supply? But these kind of choices around biofuels, food security, insulation of homes, recycling and the circular economy, and there are lots of other examples, are all about how you don't look at policies in isolation, but you look at them in their connection. So a lot of the discussions about breaking down the silos in government, and a lot of discussions about horizontal actions across governing institutions, comes from the analysis which says, in the real world, these things are connected. It's not just because we think it's a more efficient way of running our committees, it's also because when we look at diet and healthcare and sport, they are related. When we look at skills training and immigration and how we look after old people, they're related. So these kind of interchanges are what I'd call real world changes. I think what I find interesting is that there tends to be a view sometimes that among the academic community especially, that as soon as a new idea comes along, everything is like that. You know, it's now all about wicked problems. It's now all about the nexus. I think we have different scenarios in policymaking existing at the same time. We still have a good old 1950s command and control scenario. There are some aspects of public administration and government which operate on that kind of top-down basis. There is a marketized, contracted out scenario that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher would have recognized. There is consensus-based, self-regulated, participatory scenarios. There's a revitalized scenario for the state, which is very active and important now, partly coming out of COVID, but also many new actors saying that the role of the state can no longer be just in the background, but has to take the lead in some areas. So Mary Mazzucato's idea of the entrepreneurial state, ideas which go back to OECD work actually in the 1980s and 90s with Lundvall, and to Polanyi and Dewey. Ideas come and go, and they become fashionable. But actually those parallel policy realities continue alongside each other, and they live in their own way. It's not surprising that scenarios coexist. I think for me the more interesting question is incompatibilities between scenarios. And I think there are some interesting incompatibilities which make it quite difficult for public policy organizations to live simultaneously in two different worlds. So we know from the old research done over 1950s and 60s into industrial management by objectives, by incentive systems, and that was the origins of new public management. It was the transferring that industrial model of incentives and piecework into government. We know that pressures for performativity, for good performance, for performance management, makes horizontal collaboration and risk-taking and innovation much more difficult. So there is a contradiction there to manage. And we also know that maximizing efficiency often threatens sustainability. We saw that very clearly during COVID. You know, in my country, everybody was very proud that we got rid of all these hospital beds because we ran our hospitals at 99% occupancy. Crisis. How much space do you have to deal with bovine encephalitis or COVID? And these notions are well established in research. I mean, March and Simon argued back in the 1960s about the difference between maximizing and optimizing. And those understandings of the limits of efficiency, if you also want sustainability, are other areas of sort of difficulty which need to be resolved and create problems in the mindset of people in government. I mean, I am familiar with senior civil servants who find it difficult to change their discourse from now we're all about performance, but we're also being very concerned about sustainability. I think the way the kinds of solutions that people offer to these kind of more uncertain and complex ideas, some of them are very old and well established. I mean, I think I can find papers going back about 30 years that discuss the need to break down silos. We may not have made a great deal of progress on it, but breaking down silos has definitely been a song that has been repeated in many concerts and many conferences for at least 30 years. And everybody talks about decentralization and devolution and then argues about what kind of decentralization is appropriate. One of the persistent themes is the discussions about what do we mean by leadership. Because the more centralized models of traditional government still and industrial governance still favor sort of heroic leadership, where it's the job of the leader to articulate a vision for the future and to encourage everybody else to follow that lead, as opposed to kind of more boundary-spanning, enabling, inclusive and distributed leadership, which is almost inevitable when you're trying to work in more decentralized structures and when you're trying to involve civil society and when you're trying to work in the governance frame of participation as well as the government frame. And there are an interesting new generation of initiatives around policy labs, citizens' juries, deliberative workshops, online consultative platforms, which do seem to be experimenting in quite interesting ways. So, a new initiative set up in the Netherlands to deal with problems in all I care about is it's not my phone. To deal with inner city problems, basically gives them the problem. The government, I think it was of Nijmegen or maybe it was Amsterdam, they basically said, we understand the problem, we don't know how to solve it, you run a pilot project and see how you would operate these things in your context. Another common response at the moment is to use the word adaptation. I mean, I'm nervous about adaptation. In the days before Google, we had a stop word facility in our search engines where we couldn't use a certain word. Complexity was a good example of that. Everything was complex. Now everything is adaptive. There's adaptive management, adaptive policy making, adaptive governance, adaptive planning, adaptive problem solving. I think I've read about 20 categories of adaptive papers in the last 3 months. But they did come from a particular setting, often environmental and ecological, and they are spreading. So the notion is that under conditions of deep uncertainty, planners follow an adaptive approach, develop a strategic vision for the long term and a framework to guide action that includes mitigation and hedging actions along adaptation pathways. So that way of thinking, where you accept that you cannot plan everything, but you can decide where you want to go. You can take an initial decision about the pathways you want. You can set up actions of a mitigation and hedging kind to protect your pathway as far as possible, and you continue to review it. So those kind of ideas are becoming increasingly common within the perception that uncertainty is the big challenge. Another example of that would be Sable and Zeitlin's notion of experimentalist governance, where they take on the limitations of command and control and say the issue is not where we want to get to, but it's how we get there. And this kind of deliberative framework is the kind of thing you see in the European Union's open method of coordination, in the way the Water Directive has been implemented, and in environmental terms has been practiced in many years in water basin management and river management systems that cross country boundaries in Latin America and in Africa, which there's a lot written about in CGIAR stuff. So what I'm trying to communicate here is that the emergent policy systems are indeed posing serious problems of uncertainty and challenging some of the existing and old questions in governance around silos and decentralization and innovation. But there is a new generation of at least thinking about what kind of solutions and responses we can imagine in those situations. There is, however, the voice of pessimism as well as the voice of gloom. I recently depressed myself, I think mainly because it's about 700 pages long, reading the book on Radical Uncertainty by John Kay and Mervyn King. And to save you having to read the whole book, unless you are of masochistic inclination, in which case you're entirely welcome, they make a distinction between resolvable uncertainty and radical uncertainty. So I think, really, if you talk about the uncertainty literature, there's kind of, routine standardization. There's uncertainty, there's deep uncertainty, there's resolvable uncertainty, and there's radical uncertainty. So it's in terms of how far you want to go down the line of being able to or not able to deal with things. Resolvable uncertainty, as far as King and Kay are concerned, says that with the right tools, with trend analysis and probability distributions and decision tools and big data and artificial intelligence, and working harder, we can make manageable things that we think are not manageable. But there are some things we can't do that. There are no probability distributions. We just have to, in their language, ask ourselves the question, what is going on? And my concern, I suppose, given the moment in time that we are all living in, is that I go to meetings with agencies and governments, and I go to conferences where there is a kind of a schizophrenia going on. There's one set of people who are saying, this is a crisis. This is like going to be the oil shock of the 1970s. We cannot predict exactly what's going to happen. We've got climate change on top of that. The business as usual logic is not likely to be viable. And there are others who say, Yes, but with modern tools and with thinking about it and with involving civil society and taking a broader view, we can resolve these issues. And I leave it to you in this conference to decide by the end of today which of these two perspectives is true. Thank you very much.